The Last Frontier starts at Eielson Air Force Base in Alaska. Before the plane takes off, a hooded criminal bound in chains is brought on board, with several other prisoners already seated and on their way to be transported to the designated location. The masked criminal is tied to his chair, suggesting that he is much more dangerous than the others. The danger posed by him becomes clearer when the plane is struck by an explosion mid-flight. Unfazed by the bodies flying out of the broken side, the masked prisoner frees himself from his restraints and moves towards the cockpit, where the pilots try to land the plane safely. They fail, and the plane crashes in an icy land in the middle of nowhere. The criminals who survive the crash use it as an opportunity to escape, throwing the nearby Alaskan town into chaos. U.S. Marshal Frank Remnick has given his life to the job, but now he wants to retire. He tells his wife Sarah that they have finally acquired the cabin they had been trying to buy, and that afternoon they need to clear their schedules so that they can meet their real estate agent, finalize the deal, and move forward with their plan to open a bed and breakfast. Sarah, a nurse, is happy that her husband will finally leave behind a trying job and get to spend more time with the family. Frank, too, has no reservations about getting an early retirement because their town never really gets into any trouble. Unbeknownst to him, the plane crashes in the wilderness, and its smoke leads a resident to call 911. Soon after Frank arrives at the station, the call comes in, and he joins his friends and fellow officers, Donnie and Hutch. They take a helicopter and find the crashed plane. There is no one around, which is unusual because, following the crash, we see everyone erupting into a fight, with one particularly menacing criminal emerging from the crash with barely a scratch. Since Frank and his team have no idea what they are up against, they don't think about the missing convicts. But then they find an injured U.S. Marshal and a broken pair of handcuffs. As soon as the reality of the situation dawns on Frank, the injured man says, "Ambush," and all the criminals who had been hiding come running out. Clearly, they are all gunning for the helicopter, which will get them anywhere they want. Frank and his team realize this, and they run back towards the helicopter, carrying the injured man. Their efforts to save the marshal are halted when they are forced to abandon him to save themselves. In the process, Donnie gets stabbed, and Frank is also almost killed until another injured marshal shows up and saves him. Eventually, Frank, his team, and the marshal who saved Frank make it to the helicopter and leave the scene. The CIA responds immediately after learning about the crash. Their concern is about the hooded prisoner called Havlock, who is their top priority. To catch him, Agent Sydney Schofield, who is drunk and depressed, is called into action. She is sent to Alaska with the express instructions of capturing Havlock. She is asked to gain the trust of the local law enforcement, particularly Frank, because without their help, she will never be able to navigate the town and retrieve her prisoner. Donnie is flown to the hospital while Frank talks to the injured marshal, identified as Granger. It seems that his eyes were injured in the crash, so there is a blindfold on him. He tells Frank that they were made to make an unscheduled pit stop on the way, where they picked up the hooded prisoner named Havlock. Granger suspects that Havlock seemed smarter and more self-assured than any other prisoner on board, and there is a good possibility that he is behind the crash. When Frank pushes for more details, Granger says he doesn't know anything more, and the conversation ends when he is taken to the hospital. With the threat of the escaped convicts being so close to town, an advisory is issued, especially at the school, where everyone is told to stay put while the game for that day is canceled. Unfortunately, Frank's son Luke and his girlfriend miss the announcement as they sneak out and drive away. Sydney arrives on the scene and is bombarded with questions from Frank. She tries to avoid answering them by saying that the details are classified. But then he mentions Havlock, and she realizes that she may not have the option to keep things from him. She also notes something peculiar about a dead inmate, but she is more concerned about finding her target. At the hospital, Frank receives news that Donnie's condition is worsening. He arrives there and has a brief chat with Granger, who is under Sarah's care. Before he can ask any more questions, Frank is drawn away by the crying sounds of Donnie's wife and realizes that his friend is dead. This information hits him hard, and it makes him even more determined to find out what really happened to the plane and what role Havlock played in it. Realizing that she cannot work with Frank while keeping information from him, Sydney reveals that Havlock is a former CIA agent who turned rogue. He was trained as part of the Atwater Protocol, designed to flush out moles and enemies of the agency. But ironically, he himself turned against them. She emphasizes that it is important to find him, and soon enough, they get a radio call. It is made by one of the lone men on an outpost. This man is under the captivity of Havlock, and realizing the resources that he would receive at the place, Sydney confirms that it has to be their man. Frank and the team converge at the house, and after an altercation where Frank refuses to shoot the criminal, leading Sydney to throw the dogs at him, the situation is contained. The criminal dies, but the problem is that he is not identified as Havlock. By that time, the details about the passenger manifest start to arrive, and Sydney points out that one of the dead men in a criminal's uniform is actually U.S. Marshal Granger. This is when Frank realizes that the man he talked to is Havlock. He immediately calls Sarah, but by then, it is too late. When Frank arrives at the hospital, the criminal is gone, and so is Frank's wife. Frank gets angry with Sydney because she kept the details about Havlock to herself. Meanwhile, she calls her boss Bradford, who reveals that finding Havlock is important because he has access to Archive 6. It is the blueprint of their workings, and it holds information about the Atwater Protocol and all the missions that have been executed under it. If the details of Archive 6 fall into the wrong hands, it would cripple the agency irreparably, possibly even leading to its demise. Meanwhile, Frank's son Luke and his girlfriend are completely off-grid. While driving to the cabin, their car broke down, and with no phone signals, they have no way to reach anyone for help. The only upside is that they are at the cabin, where they have everything to keep them alive and well. It seems that Luke had planned a romantic getaway for him and his girlfriend, but now she is frustrated with his lack of proper planning, which has left them stranded in the middle of nowhere. Elsewhere, Frank tells his friend to pick up Luke from school, only to discover later that his son snuck out. This leads him to assign another officer to the task of finding his son and keeping him safe. Havlock, meanwhile, starts executing his plan. He calls Bradford and tells her that he has put the archive on a countdown, at the end of which it will be sent to all the interested parties. This can only be prevented if he disables the program from executing, which needs to happen every 72 hours. Havlock also disables the phone lines throughout the town, knowing that it will make the task of catching him even more difficult. He also leaves a message for Frank, asking him to do his bidding to ensure Sarah's safety. This puts the protagonist in a very precarious situation, but there is no way but to move forward. It is revealed that Havlock made the call from Frank's house, where he left a tape for him. Sydney finds it and watches it herself before handing it over to Frank. In the video, Havlock reveals that he is ready to trade Sarah for a prisoner who was on seat 12A of the plane. Frank is against this trade, while Sydney encourages him to do it. Meanwhile, Frank decides to find the criminal and discover his connection with Havlock. It turns out that the criminal, Henry Sickler, surrendered himself earlier that day. He is found to be a money launderer, in addition to other things that he did for his criminal bosses, who tried to kill him when they found out he was stealing from them. When asked about his connection to Havlock, Sickler says he has never heard that name before. Later, it is revealed that Sickler had made a deal with the DOJ in exchange for witness protection, which is why he had surrendered in the first place. That still leaves the question of why Havlock wants him. While the cops are busy with Havlock, other criminals find ways to survive. One of them holds a man and his young son at gunpoint. He is later joined by two other criminals. One criminal, who died of the cold, is brought to the station by the locals who think there will be a bounty on his head. Another criminal is found unconscious by Luke and his girlfriend, who have no idea that he is a criminal. They take him to the cabin and nurse him back to life. Fortunately, the officer Frank had sent to look for them finds them, but he reports that they won't be able to come back until the next morning because the roads are snowed in. Meanwhile, Sarah makes an escape attempt, but Havlock gets the upper hand on her and chains her securely, leaving no room for error again. A flashback reveals that Sidney recruited Havlock after he demonstrated exceptional promise in breaking through complex security systems and firewalls. Now he is planning something else, and Sidney knows that it's nothing good. The problem is that she is believed to be complicit with him, and Bradford's boss advised her to throw Sidney under the bus if that's what it takes to protect herself and her superiors from the mess created by Havlock. Sidney knows what's on the line if Havlock is not stopped. So, when Frank asks her to tell him something about the enemy, she tells him about Havlock being in possession of the archive and the damage he can inflict using it. Just then, they receive a package from Havlock. It is a radio device with which he intends to communicate with Frank during the exchange. Frank shows up at the rendezvous with Hutch posing as Sickler. But soon, they realize that Havlock never wanted Sickler. The exchange was a way for him to distract them and divert their resources, giving him the space to get to the recordings from the plane and take what he wanted. By the time Frank and the others arrive at the vehicle tasked with transporting the recordings to the station, Havlock has already done his job. The only thing he has left behind is a box for Frank. The U.S. Marshal has a somber expression when he opens it, but it is not revealed what the box contains. Elsewhere, the man who is under the captivity of 3 escaped criminals encourages his son to run while their captors are not looking, giving him a much greater chance of getting help and surviving. Third episode begins as 2 guys fishing out on the ice heard something outside their little cabin thing. They find that kid whose dad sent him into the snow, hoping someone might find him, half frozen and barely breathing. To Frank's relief, the box contains a sign that Havlock is playing nice. It's got Sarah's car keys in it. They can't possibly start a manhunt in the dark wilderness of Alaska. But Havlock clearly wants them to find Sarah's car, and he's left it at an easy enough spot for the marshals to locate. There's nothing in the car, but the car's navigation history gets them Sarah's location in no time. This is only happening because Havlock wanted Frank to get Sarah back. It's his way to earn Frank's trust before he gets to what he wants. Up at the cabin, the officer Hayes shows up to check on Luke and Kira. They're not there, though, but he does wind up in trouble. The inmate sneaks up behind Hayes and knocks him out cold. The scuffle awakens Luke and Kira, who happens to be upstairs asleep. When Luke finds the guy downstairs, they actually talk plainly, and Luke reveals that his dad is a marshal. Kira is a bit smarter and finds Hayes' car outside, and, subsequently, the files confirming that the guy in their cabin is one of the inmates. When Kira tells Luke about what she's found, they try to devise a plan to escape. Unfortunately, it doesn't work, and they're held at gunpoint and forced to concede. After Frank finds Sarah's abandoned car, Frank is pissed and calls on some extra forces, namely in the form of Hutch and his buddies. They don't find Havlock, but do manage to track down a few other inmates. Frank catches up to the young kid, Caleb, after he's brought back to camp. He's from New York originally and only 8. He learns about the inmates that have taken his father and realizes how serious this situation is. Hearing the kid's testimony hits hard, and Caleb also recognizes the inmates on the wall as the ones who have taken his dad. He mentions a river, too, which gives some clue over where they need to look. Interestingly, Havlock is not too far away and runs into those same inmates. He claims to be out camping and nobody recognizes him as the inmate on board the plane. The inmates take him with them, unaware of the threat he poses. Unfortunately, the inmates find a transport just out in the wild, run by a company called Alyeska Arctic Adventures. It seems they're in the general area scouting local wildlife like a frozen safari. They were actually in the midst of a 6-day tour of the Arctic Circle, too. This transport is called the Tundra Buggy. Apparently, they didn't get the memo about the inmates, and it doesn't take long for the men to head over and hold them all up at gunpoint. Outside, Frank continues to keep Sidney at arm's length. However, she bites back and reveals how she's also being taken for a ride here. She's not being told the full story about the prison transport and wants answers just like he does. Word of the hostage situation reaches our guys, who assess the situation. Now, the inmates are a rabble of nasty individuals, ranging from the big guy, Argento Volpe, to his assistant, Edward Porter, and another dangerous guy called Spencer Todd Covington. The boy's father is also with them, Sam Barker. Now, in the middle of all this, Frank manages to find Sarah and get her back. Sydney shows up and wants to talk to her, but Frank immediately shuffles her out the room. Now that she's back, Frank is at least a bit more at ease, but there's still the Luke situation that they need to try and resolve. Spencer Covington is the one leading the inmate charge, and it doesn't take long for him to turn his attention to Havlock. The guy is just nonchalantly on his laptop, but radio chatter and increased activity nearby makes him realize Havlock is special. Well, he shows his skills by immediately taking down all 4 men and taking control of the rig. Sarah speaks to Sydney next and goes over what she remembers from being captured. She knows Havlock was printing numbers, but his purpose appears to be with Frank. He seems to have identified a weakness that he can exploit. Sydney believes Havlock wants to control Frank and manipulate him. Well, he soon communicates through and speaks to Frank, telling him he's a man of his word. With Sarah back, there's something else Havlock wants: Sydney's Xenogate passcode. This code happens to be holding the identities and locations of every asset she's developed in the field. Eventually, she concedes, but that's the least of their problems. Luke and Kira radio through to say they're fine. They're not. And then the radio is destroyed, leaving their fate unknown for the time being. Sydney does reveal here that the file mentioned earlier was actually her father's doing. He created this clandestine program in the wake of 9/11, but now the program he gave his life for is being weaponized against her. While Sydney is trying to do what she can for her father's legacy, Frank opens up and admits that he lost his daughter 2 weeks before her 9th birthday. Frank blames himself for her loss, and there's not a day that goes by that this job doesn't tear him apart with guilt because of this. For now, we don't know the full story here. The helicopter shows up in the frozen tundra, just as Havlock messages someone, telling them he'll contact at the Bluebird tomorrow. Frank touches down and shows up to see Havlock and the others. He wants to bargain with him and shows up. He manages to save Sam, but Havlock bites back, explaining that he knows about his secret. While they talk, Sydney shows and manages to attach a chain to the front of the transport, which lifts them right off the ground and into the air. The inmates fall out one by one and are picked up by the authorities. The plan works a treat, and they manage to surround Havlock. Only he decides to drive off the cliff face, still attached to the helicopter. A scuffle ensues between him and Frank as they race toward the cliff edge and find themselves hanging for dear life. It's touch and go until Havlock reenacts the scene from The Lost World and has to navigate the glass. Eventually, Sydney catches up, but she hesitates to shoot him. Instead, he kicks the glass in and escapes. The reason, as we soon realize, is because she and Havlock were romantically involved in the past, and he manipulated her to get what he wanted. Frank soon learns this, and he asks Sydney for help. Sydney warns that this is going to get difficult, and Havlock is going to poison his family against him. When Frank gets home, the first thing he checks is a hidden spot in the basement. Havlock wasn't kidding. He's moved whatever secret Frank is hiding from the world. But he did mention that he tucked it away safely in Alaska. Frank's quick with codes, so he opens Walter Coates' book and finds his secret stuck inside its hollowed-out chest. It's a gun. At some point, Frank stole a piece of evidence and hid it in his basement. The fact that he joins Sydney at the bar and proposes that they team up and go after Havlock means that he's gotten under Frank's skin. Frank really doesn't like that Havlock knows something personal about him. When Sydney asks if his scars have something to do with his daughter's death, he doesn't even answer her question. As for Sydney, the fight is way more complicated for her than we have assumed so far. Sydney drops the biggest bomb yet when Frank asks her why she might still care about Havlock. She claims to be his first victim. Sydney is married to Havlock, or Levi, if you want to call him by his non-CIA name. Episode 4 opens with inmates Kitty and Vivian stranded in the wilderness. Kitty is caught in a bear trap, prompting Vivian to force a woman, later revealed to be a cop, to help free her at gunpoint. When the woman tries to resist, both inmates quickly kill her and make their way to her house to stock up for a long journey. Meanwhile, Frank and Sydney are beginning to work together, though Cyber is monitoring the Xenogate account breach. They've combed 6 miles with no results, but Frank and Sydney remain convinced that Havlock is still at large. Indeed, Havlock is very much alive, preparing for the next stage of his plan while staying under the radar. The episode largely focuses on Kitty and Vivian. Kitty is revealed to be a Black Widow killer, having murdered 3 husbands, a fiancé, and a widower in Maine, amassing $4.2 million in stolen assets. Vivian, a skilled conwoman, is the brains of the duo. Together, they form a dangerous team, intent on fleeing with Kitty's money and targeting aero excursions to escape via flight-seeing tours. Frank and Sydney catch wind of this lead. At aero excursions, Frank and Sydney hack into the computer using a password written on a sticky note. Their first subject is Slade, a bush pilot with limited funds. Kitty wires him money from a chip hidden inside her glasses, allowing him to refuel and prepare for the trip. Meanwhile, Sarah seeks counseling for her frustration over the situation and wishes to check on Luke. Her counselor, Todd Logan, offers a ride, but Luke is out on the road with a paranoid inmate. Luke orchestrates an accident to evade him, causing the inmate to fly out of the car. Langley discovers the likely purpose of Havlock's Xenogate message, communication with an informant in St. Petersburg, Armin Zdenko, a malware and security specialist potentially involved in stealing Archive 6. Back in Alaska, Vivian is captured after Kitty abandons her and escapes with Slade. Frank and Sydney negotiate with Vivian, securing Kitty's location. Kitty is heading to Farmer's Loop, ready to fly when police arrive. Bleeding heavily, she collapses in the woods, pleading to be left to die, but Frank insists on bringing her in alive. Frank and Sydney realize Vivian has been manipulating Kitty from the start. She has taken the SIM card, using Kitty as a cover, and orchestrated her own tip to the police. Satisfied with her deal, Frank and Sydney allow Vivian to go in exchange for information on Havlock, who is heading to Fairbanks to settle unfinished business with an old friend, his courier Vincent Tiago, already in position 24 hours before the crash. Meanwhile, Sarah reaches the cabin to find Luke gone. Surviving the car crash, Luke leads the killer away on the road, giving Kira a chance to escape while he confronts the threat himself. Next, we see Kira being rescued by a native in the wilderness. She's freezing and injured, but is brought to the tribe for care and patched up. Meanwhile, Frank and the team are trying to track Havlock's courier, but Havlock calls and taunts them. He demands to speak to Frank personally about a secret, questioning if he can be trusted. Frank replies cautiously, buying enough time for the team to trace the call to room 130 at Klondike Lodge along Parks Highway. Frank's focus is divided when he learns Kira has been found, but Luke is missing. He flies to meet Kira, showing her mugshots of the escaped inmates until she identifies the right one. Luke, however, is trapped with Romero, a paranoid and psychotic man. Romero takes Luke hostage, steals a salt truck, and claims they have work to do. Romero has a vendetta against DARPA, where he once worked before a psychotic break led him to kill several employees. Romero drives Luke to a substation to pick up a large metal contraption, causing a local power outage, and then heads to a military research laboratory south of their location. Authorities warn Harp, but the facility is confident due to its secure battery backup. At Klondike Lodge, police raid room 130, finding a dog in the bath and little else. Havlock is present, observing Sydney from afar before vanishing. Inside, the cops discover the archive. Sydney suspects it may be a trap, a Trojan horse designed to mislead them, especially as Vincent Thiago's passports are fake and unregistered. She also realizes her home is bugged, warning Molly to stay off the main line, only for Havlock to appear nearby. Alone, Sydney is tempted by Havlock, who even leaves his handgun behind as an invitation. Back in the wilderness, Frank and Sarah clash. Havlock has given Sarah a SIM card containing a recording of the crash, which she withheld from Frank. Their argument is interrupted when Frank notices a trail of salt, realizing Luke is leaving them a path to follow. At the facility, Luke plays along with Romero's paranoia, allowing him to stab Romero in the leg and escape. Frank and Sarah arrive just in time for a high-stakes chase, culminating with Sarah ramming Romero's vehicle and leaving him severely injured. Although the family is reunited, they remain fractured and far from the happy family of earlier episodes. That night, Donnie's memory is honored at a bar, including a silent auction. The moment is interrupted when Molly calls Sydney. The FBI has arrived, confiscating everything. Sydney angrily demands her family be left alone. Meanwhile, Frank contemplates Havlock's plan. The archive appears to contain navigational data rather than state secrets. The courier may not work directly for Havlock, but possibly for the CIA, with the hard drive functioning as malware that originally brought down the plane. Cole informs Frank, during a tense moment with Sarah, that Romero's plan involved HARP's failsafe protocol. Without the correct switch, the battery backup combined with the main power could overload the system. Moments later, the town experiences a complete power outage. While Havlock seems to be operating from his backup, a pair of paramedics fall victim to an escaped inmate, Dr. William Wigg, dubbed the Angel of Death. Wigg tortures the paramedics, steals their gear, injects one, locks him in an ambulance, and drives off with the other. Back in town, Frank and the team regroup. 6 inmates remain on the run, and Frank calls for additional manpower. Sydney, however, is preoccupied with the mysterious hard drive, wary that the Bureau will seize it before its contents are understood. Frank enlists Mike from Chicago to help identify the elusive courier, Vincent Tiago, who appears to be a ghost, with only one historical photo ever surfacing. At the hospital, Wigg poses as a medic and encounters Sarah. Sensing danger, she calls Frank, insisting on his involvement despite her preference to handle things herself. Wigg is a seasoned killer with 36 murders to his name and was en route to execution in Terre Haute before the Alaskan transport crash. His demand is clear: transfer his safety deposit box or the pilot, Timothy O'Bannon, will die. O'Bannon is stable but suffering from worsening brain swelling, making the situation urgent. Frank coordinates the logistics to get the deposit box to Alaska, while the team finds the abandoned ambulance in the woods. Sydney confronts Frank, revealing she knows the plane crash was orchestrated, similar to a prior mission where she was tasked with eliminating a high-profile Chinese diplomat. Now, her own life is at risk. If Havlock is apprehended, the Bureau will need a scapegoat, and Sydney is the obvious target. Havlock is deliberately giving Frank clues, seeking a custodian of the truth who can control the narrative away from the FBI. Meanwhile, Frank contacts Havlock, who confirms only that the pilot is alive, prompting another nocturnal manhunt. Using the sound of church bells, the group deduces Havlock is near Carillon Clock Tower, likely inside the adjacent theater. They locate him in a booby-trapped venue, but he escapes, though they capture Vincent Tiago. Using a chilling Greek proverb from Vincent, Frank devises a plan: create a makeshift runway at Rosie Creek Farm with car headlights to guide the pilot. Townsfolk rally to the cause. The bank manager delivers the deposit box, ironically the mother of one of Wigg's victims. She kills Wigg, despite his claim that he freed her son from terminal cancer via narcotics. Throughout, Vincent remains bugged, feeding audio to Havlock. Meanwhile, Frank and Sydney interrogate the pilot, who confirms Havlock saved everyone by forcing the plane into manual reversion, preventing a major crash. Despite this victory, Sydney's troubles worsen. The FBI has the hard drive, discovered it contains a preset guidance system, and now hold it as evidence against her. Next, we see a flashback to 4 years ago in Chicago. Frank is at a hot dog stand with Luke and baby Ruby when a drive-by shooting erupts. Ruby is killed in Frank's arms, and Luke calls authorities, but it's too late. This tragedy sets the emotional tone for the present-day events. In the present, the team is racing against time. Although they need to question Vincent Tiago, information is limited to a few old photos. Sydney convinces Frank to let her handle the interrogation alongside him, hoping to make Tiago sweat. She threatens to reconstruct his scrubbed CIA history, which could make him a liability. Havlock listens in as Tiago remains calm, willing to risk everything for his mission, and challenging Frank and Sydney to do the same. Complications arise as the power returns, and fugitives Julian Steele and Marcus Ramsey are still at large. Langley becomes aware that Tiago is in custody, and Bradford moves to neutralize the dead man's switch, removing Havlock's leverage. It's revealed that Tiago was also Sidney's father's protege, deepening the personal stakes. With the radios back online, a transmission signal leads Sidney to discover that Vincent is wired. Initially suspecting the CIA, they trace the signal back to Havlock. Meanwhile, Frank must attend to a family emergency. Sarah and Luke reveal a hidden gun from Frank's past investigation of fugitive Patty Kugan. Although Kugan had been innocent of the crime, he blamed Frank for Ruby's death, explaining the attack in Chicago. Luke is furious at having blamed himself all this time, while Sarah struggles with the revelation. Frank prioritizes the manhunt and tracks a lead to a fire tower. On the way, Marcus Ramsey is apprehended. At the tower, Havlock is already gone, a deviation from his usual meticulousness. Sidney realizes Havlock may be emotionally compromised and deduces he is seeking the location of an NSA listening post holding a copy of his data. He coerces a low-level operative and heads to the docks, with Frank and Sidney close behind. At sea, Havlock quickly neutralizes security, seizes weapons, and accesses the archives. Bradford remains silent about the dead man's switch, leaving Sidney unaware that Havlock's leverage is gone. After grabbing the data, he hotwires a car and flees, but Sidney saves him in a high-stakes chase just as police arrive. Back at the command post, Frank updates Sidney on the final inmate spotted in Tulsa and leaves it to local authorities. He insists Sidney accompany him on the investigation to aid in clearing her name, strengthening their mutual trust and respect. The episode concludes with a shocking revelation. Reviewing old photos, Frank realizes the little girl standing next to Tiago is connected to Robert Schofield, Sidney's father. It becomes clear that Tiago isn't working for the CIA. He's working for Sidney. The plane crash, the chaos, and the manipulation were all orchestrated by her, revealing that Sidney has been secretly pulling the strings from the start. Next on the road, we see Sidney intercepting Havlock's transport. Havlock reveals he's been listening in on a hidden conversation where Sidney scolded Tiago for being captured. This provoked his outburst at the fire tower, not the dead man's switch. When Frank calls to warn her, chaos erupts. Agents are overpowered, Shaw is killed, the driver dies, and the van is smashed, careening out of control. Sidney regains consciousness first, holding Havlock at gunpoint. The story then flashes back 1 month to Paris. Sidney and Havlock are in hiding with Elizabeth, an asset from Ukraine, who is in danger. Havlock wants to leave and escape, but Sidney refuses. A black market operative, Victor Voss, appears seeking safe passage in exchange for revealing what happened to Sidney's father. Convinced, Sidney deletes files and helps him escape. Russians attempt to assassinate Voss, but Sidney neutralizes them with explosives. Voss is fatally wounded, but confirms he killed Sidney's father. Meanwhile, Havlock has embedded code into a contact report, tracing a file back to a classified Langley server. Archive 6, created by Sidney's father, contains the real files on him and provides leverage. Sharon Tidwell, responsible for covering Voss's assignments and refusing to testify, becomes a key source. Though she urges Sidney to stop, Sidney doubles down on uncovering the truth. Bradford, suspecting Sidney's collaboration with Havlock, confronts her. Sidney remains composed, realizing the agency's corruption is deeper than she imagined. Guided by her mother, Sidney uncovers the truth via Vincent Tiago, who explains he worked alongside Sidney's father for 6 years until he was assassinated to protect Archive 6 and the Atwater Protocol. Robert Schofield saw the protocol as a last resort tool to eliminate targets, while Bradford exploited it to remove political enemies, killing agents to cover her tracks. Robert spoke out and was killed, Tiago vanished, erasing himself from agency records, and Sidney vowed to finish her father's mission and expose the corruption. Sidney orchestrates the downing of the plane via the dead man's switch, anticipating Havlock's eventual death. Her insider knowledge of the agency allows her to predict their plan. On board, Havlock works to stabilize the plane, minimizing casualties and inadvertently saving lives. Sidney had assumed the plane was a cargo transport, not a prison flight. Havlock's survival explains the opening scenes of Episode 1. Returning to the present, Sydney holds Havlock at gunpoint. He offers to provide her with Archive 6, but with the dead man's switch off and Bradford aware of her role in the plane crash, the situation is tense. Surprisingly, Havlock has reconstructed the archive into a hard copy, effectively carrying it with him. He hands it over and attempts to negotiate. Frank arrives, also aiming a gun at Havlock, claiming Sydney is gone, further escalating the standoff. Next, we see Sydney calling Frank, pleading with him to stop chasing her. Frank refuses, but Sydney warns that things will only get worse. At Fort Wainwright in Fairbanks, Bradford discovers that Sydney possesses a hard copy of the archive. She mobilizes her troops to track Sydney down at any cost. Meanwhile, Havlock is in Frank's custody, attracting attention from all sides. He and Thiago exchange a knowing glance, but the critical conversation occurs between Frank and Havlock. They discuss CIA secrets, the contents of the archive, and Bradford's presence. Havlock urges Frank to see reason, warning that if Sydney dies, the truth dies with her. Thiago emphasizes that Sydney is determined to expose the truth and will stop at nothing. Frank launches a manhunt to find Sydney, racing against time while Bradford also closes in. She arrives at the command center, demanding that Havlock and Thiago be handed over, which Frank refuses. The confrontation moves to Frank's office, where Bradford attempts to assert authority and intimidate him, but Frank stands firm. Frustrated, she ultimately concedes and leaves. The team traces Sydney to a nearby pharmacy, where she had purchased hair dye with the help of a worker, Geraldo. However, Bradford arrives first and detains the worker, learning that Sydney inquired about the Denali star at the Fairbanks depot. Sydney, now with bright orange-dyed hair and sunglasses, is at the train station. Bradford sends men to board the train, intending to search the carriages. Sydney cleverly takes a hostage and escapes at the next station, Healy. Bradford quickly realizes the area is near the Nanana Hydroelectric Dam, a prime location for uploading the archive due to its secure satellite uplinks and high bandwidth. With Frank distracted by the pursuit, Havlock engineers a cell escape. Using a fake grenade made from grease and an apple, he tricks the guards into letting him go. Once free, Havlock assists Thiago, who stages a public scene to cover their exit. Havlock learns that Sydney knowingly put him in danger, effectively signing his death warrant. Their escape succeeds as they slip out the back undetected. Bradford catches up with Sydney and holds her at gunpoint, but Frank realizes that the pharmacy tip-off was called in by Sydney herself, though her motives are still unclear. At the same time, Havlock reappears and confronts Bradford, setting the stage for a tense showdown. Bradford believes she's finally cornered her two most dangerous assets, but Havlock's plan unfolds before she can react. For weeks, he has secretly contacted former operatives, agents who, like him and Sydney, were used and discarded by Bradford's classified Atwater protocol. One by one, they arrive at the dam facility, not as Bradford's reinforcements, but as witnesses prepared to testify against her. Confronted by a room filled with people she exploited, Bradford continues to insist that the protocol is essential for national security. But the agents have heard enough. When one operative hesitates, shaken by Bradford's sudden tears, Jock uses the moment to stab him and regain control. Chaos erupts. Sydney breaks away, racing toward the control room to upload the archive to the Director of National Intelligence. Bradford shuts down the power to stop the upload, seizing an axe as she hunts Sydney through the facility. Their fight drags them toward the dam's roaring turbines, where Bradford delivers blow after blow, desperate to protect the secrets she built her career on. But Sydney escapes her grip long enough for Bradford to lose her footing and fall into the turbine chamber below. Her body disappears into the water, ending her hold on the protocol. Frank and Havlock arrive at the dam just in time to save Sydney, who collapses from a deep stab wound. Havlock uses the moment to slip away, knowing Frank will prioritize Sydney's life over capturing him. Local volunteers rush Sydney to a small clinic, and the doctor manages to stabilize her. As she's loaded for transport to Fairbanks, she hands Frank Archive 6, the final evidence needed to expose Jock's operation. Havlock stages his own death soon after, burning a body in a crashed car, arranged to match his physical profile, even down to the missing molar. Frank isn't fooled, but chooses to let the ruse stand, understanding that Havlock's escape will keep Sydney safer. Back in Fairbanks, Frank seeks out Ted, a respected Alaskan political figure connected to Hutch's family. Frank trusts Ted to open a formal investigation without drawing immediate federal retaliation. Ted accepts the archive, unaware of its explosive contents but understanding the gravity of Frank's request. Sydney, recovering in the hospital, spirals over Bradford's final claim that they are alike. Frank reassures her that she acted for the right reasons, even if she broke every rule doing it. He admits his own history of bending the law, especially after losing his daughter Ruby, and tells Sydney that guilt does not make her a monster. Though the CIA prepares to charge Sydney in a closed-door case, Frank refuses to surrender to the system. He destroys the stolen gun linked to his past and returns to his cabin, where Sarah and Luke help him clean up the place and rebuild their family life. But the peace is short-lived. Frank receives a call from Havlock, alive, hidden, and preparing to strike again. He warns Frank that he's organizing a rescue operation. Sydney is being transported, and he refuses to let her disappear into federal custody. In the episode's final moments, Sydney sits shackled inside the transport vehicle, recognizing the sound of incoming explosions. A small smile forms. Havlock has come for her.